Okay, after all of that fun, can everyone please take their seats? I feel as if we should have scheduled 3, 4, maybe 5, maybe a week. A 7-day powwow, not just one day. It's impossible to get through the depth and the complexity of all of these themes in one day. So I think that Mamphela would be proud of us, first of all. Proud of the conversations that we've had so far, proud of the exchange that we are having, and the fact that we're all integrating and trying to speak and listen to each other. We're now moving into the afternoon session, and a session which in some ways many would call quite technical, quite offensive as we talk about money. Finance. It's been mentioned already many times before, and in fact several of the young leaders who are here have come up to me and said, can the Club of Rome help us? Can the Club of Rome give us some finance for some of our projects that we're trying to undertake? And you are so loud in your voices, the many, many, many projects that are out there that need proper capital flow, that need to actually get off the ground. And yet, obviously, the capital is not going to where it needs to go. So there's no one better, from the Club of Rome perspective, in fact, 2 people, to lead this conversation. One is Michael Dorsey, who's made a pledge, and he will tell you, to really dedicate his life to ensuring that capital flows to where it needs to go, towards renewable energy and towards cleaner technologies. And the other is Peter Bloem, who I have the honor of working with in Brussels, who is the CEO of Triodos Bank. And for those of you who don't know about Triodos, it's one of the first sustainability banks in the world. Absolutely committed to helping small and medium-sized enterprises as well as larger enterprises and putting up the right funds in order to engage directly in sustainable projects. And with Triodos, I'm honored to launch today, and Peter will speak about it, a new Club of Rome finance hub that will be located in the Triodos offices in Brussels to look at sustainable finance and change finance. We will change the finance system. We must change the finance system. That is what this panel will be about. So Michael, please take over.
Good afternoon. That's the lunch effect. Let's do it again. Good afternoon. It's really an opportunity and a pleasure. Thank you all for coming and sticking after the lunch and being with us to open this really provocative conversation. Our 2 co-presenters wanted to make a little bit of change up in the order at their request, so I obliged them. So Peter is going to follow Themba Baloyi, who's going to really open us up and really set the stage for thinking about new finance, about the ways we are rethinking finance, the ways which that's actually possible and happening. At my group around the corner, we've been investing heavily in solar. We've done over 3 gigawatts so far in 6 years. About 1 gigawatt we forecast coming online in Africa within the next 3 years forward. We're working really heavily in the SADC region. We're doing so in part because the levelized cost of solar is far below not just coal, not just oil, but certainly even gas these days. So it is the sweet spot. It is the place for the future, and that's happening here in Africa. It's happening also in Asia and Latin America, in the Americas broadly defined, in Europe as well. And we're doing that because that is the way in which we're rethinking finance. So I want to bring up Themba to the mic.
Good afternoon. That was muted Good afternoon.
Afternoon. There we are.
I hope today's discussions have been very energizing, and we are not going to just talk about these issues, but we're going to translate into action. I'm very much action-oriented, and I'm hoping that these discussions, they put together the ideas, and those ideas lead to action. So I did say, when I was asked to give a perspective, that I first want to start with the African perspective, a proverbial African perspective to these discussions. We've already spoken quite a bit about Ubuntu and the context of Umuntu Ngumuntu Ngabantu, which is a very powerful South African, even though it goes throughout the rest of the continent, but Umuntu Ngumuntu Ngabantu has got a context to it. There is an essence which also translates into one of the other Nguni languages, which talks about izandla ziyagezana, one hand washes another hand. The reason I highlight these proverbs is because it's easy to be lost in context. We are in Africa, and the Club of Home is coming home to Africa. We need to embrace the essence of what it means to talk about these issues and to talk about finance and to talk about business in general. There is another concept which I think in the Western society is well understood, but within the African context is understood even better. And I'm going to say it slowly so that you guys can capture it, especially those who are coming from different countries. Ufunda uze ufe. Let me repeat that. Ufunda uze ufe. The context to that proverb is that it's a continuous journey of learning. If you were to do a direct translation, the translation is that you continue to learn until you die. The day you die is the day you stop learning. But I don't think it captures the essence of why I want to highlight it if you just simply do a direct translation. Ufunda uze ufe, in the context of the ideas that have been shared here, the debates that have taken place here, they cannot be left hanging without a change of action. They cannot be left hanging because we are afraid to embrace a new perspective. Another thing that I do highlight a lot is that in our journey of knowledge, what I know today, it doesn't equal to perfect knowledge. What you know today and the position that you take about issues is not perfect knowledge. Therefore, while it may have elements of truth, you need to add truth to your truth that you already have. That's how we grow as individuals. And so I was excited when I saw this conversation unfolding the way it did. But there are two other points that I want to touch on. I want to talk about the trust deficit. The deficit of trust between a number of institutions. Number one being government. Number two being the society. Number three being the business community. Number four being the media. And then number five, the judiciary or the legal system. Because our businesses, our interactions are governed by the legislative framework where we find ourselves. Now, if there is a trust deficit, then the institutions don't work. What we want to achieve doesn't work if there is a trust deficit. And I'm not saying it's all perfect, but there is a foundation of trust which becomes an acceptable currency for us to be able to do business with each other. There is a foundation of trust which becomes an enabler for us to be able to change society and to make an impact. So if we can deal with these issues and understand that collaboration is required in academia, in business, civil society, democratic institutions, we need to learn to work together and embrace the new ideas that come to the fore. And then, of course, one of the most crucial elements that we need to talk about openly and embrace deeply and close to our hearts is the purpose. There is a purposefulness, which I hope all of us have around the table and in the audience. The purposefulness of why we do business. I come from a school of thought, which I was In fact, I was in standard 8. I don't know what you call it today, but I must have been grade 6, where I learned about what is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is about people who identify real problems and seek mechanisms to bring solutions in a profitable way. But I want you to underline the essence of what it means. Solving genuine problems and finding a sustainable model to make sure that it self-perpetuates. And then finally, as I close off, what I would like us to spend a lot more time thinking about, the think tank that is the Club of Home, Club of Rome, how do you, as all of us here, for those who are members and for those who are non-members, how do you collaborate? How do we collaborate? How do we plug and play into the think tank that has already been well established? I think it will be a waste for us to meet, all of us here, and it was a great conference. Everyone talks about the ideas that have emerged, but when we are gone, we fail to plug and play to become enablers for each other. I think it will be a total waste. And I'm not saying we should agree on everything, but there is certain type of knowledge that has already been cultivated, which has been developed. Let us tap into that knowledge. Let's use that knowledge in ways that take us forward. And then, as I close off, but I just want to touch on what Peter had shared with me and why we agreed to turn the tables around as well. If you look at the work that Peter is doing, beyond Triodos, there's something called Global Alliance for Banking on Values, GABV. You can Google it, GABV. For me, it speaks volumes about a kind of leadership. And I want to remind all of you sitting here that you are all leaders in your own right. There is a kind of leadership that is required, which is about values. What type of values are we pursuing? The argument that business is only for the purpose of making money is extinct. It doesn't hold water. Your value systems as a business, my value systems as an individual, there has to be an alignment in those. And therefore, the question I'm going to leave you with, which I hope is going to stimulate a certain type of how we think about finance, how we think about the way we do business, is what are you doing with the access and influence that you have? We all have a certain degree of access and influence. I have got a degree of access and influence in the insurance environment, in the insurance world, where if there is finance required, I can underwrite that. What are you doing with your access and influence? The truth is, it's not only left to the few. Today, sitting here, there is a degree of access and influence that you have, which I believe there's a call to action for you to use it effectively. Thank you very much.
Mboloy, the director, co-founder, Zetega Holdings, some provocations on trust, leadership, and values. I want to bring up now Peter Bloom, the CEO of Triodos Bank, to take us forward in this co-opening. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Very proud to be here. It remembers me the first time I came to South Africa was in 1986. And I was on an assignment for the Canadian government that has to be kept secret, because if I would make it public, the assignment, when I was entering this country, they would not allow me. And I had to find out if the Canadian government could support Stokvelds. There's a finance mechanism in townships, if they could support it. And what was very interesting, that I got the answer from the people I worked with. I said, how we can help? How can the Canadian government help you? They said, no, we can't be helped. We have to do it ourselves. And the moment they start to help, probably we are gone. We cannot continue. We have to keep that in this phase for us together. And I was very impressed by that. The Canadian government was not, because they really wanted to help. And I said, no, you can't do anything. It's better not to do anything. Wait until people are free and can really do the next step. So I feel this connection with this country, and I'm very impressed by how it has developed and have come here over time and have seen really major steps. So I'm actually not a banker. I'm 40 years in banking now, but I'm not a banker. I'm a social activist. And when I was asked to join Triodos Bank when it was founded in 1980, it was really for me a question if that was the right thing to do. I was demonstrating, I was sort of creating community companies, I was studying economics as well, and I wasn't sure if banking was my cup of tea. What was my cup of tea? Being a social activist and being an entrepreneur. And in the late 70s, that combination was not so common. You were either a capitalist entrepreneur or you were a left-wing social activist. And I felt very comfortable in both. And I felt in Triodos Bank, what was starting then, I could combine the two. And that's why I joined. And we were with 5 people and we created this small bank and we built it to now an international bank. What I think what was very important and also want to bring here, that things have evolved. It was very much about financing change. That was really our mission. Thousands of projects who had sustainability at its core, human dignity, social projects, we financed them. And we wanted to prove to the other banks that that was possible, because in the early 80s that was absolutely not seen as bankable. It's the same story as with microfinance. People first don't believe that people who have a different idea or are poor or otherwise cannot take care of a loan if they really have good ideas. And we wanted to prove that. And it took about 10 years, that's the time it took, before the other banks started to think about it. Yes, this may be a new way of looking at finance. So it was first all about financing the change. And I think there was an important moment for me 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, when we founded this global alliance for banking on values, similar banks who operate in the world, now 60 members, a very, very fast-growing organization, that we had Achim Steiner from the UN financial department, and he said, well, it's actually the combination what makes a change. Finance change and change finance. So what you discover if you go along this way, that with the old paradigm of banks only look at financial aspects and not looking at themselves, you really create very difficult situations. And I think the financial crisis 10 years ago was a really clear proof of that it didn't work. The financial system was rotten, was not working, and it still has its problems. What you see more and more over the last 10 years, that people start to realize that the change maybe is visible in the companies who start to work more sustainably, but that behind these companies there is a finance policy of banks, of pension funds, insurance companies, governments, and that looking at the money, the language of the money, is very important. And we don't get a clear picture on how money is created, very interesting question, by central banks, by other institutions, how it is created, how it is employed, what sort of criteria do you use, how open is it, how transparent is it, how much does it include other elements than just profit. Temba was mentioning that. I think that has come in the last 10 years very important. So rethinking finance is a core leverage point in change. If we only look at the real economy and do not look at finance, we not only have only half the picture, but only a quarter of the picture. Finance is really determining what is happening also in the field of sustainability. So what did we do? We created not only this global alliance for banking on values, we also created in the Netherlands a sustainable finance lab with 12 of the most known monetary professors, and started to work on the theme of how to change the financial system and relate that directly to sustainability questions. It's not just a general change, it's how can we focus the system on supporting the real economy and probably even drive the real economy in a direction. Not just follow it, but really drive it in the right direction. And there is really momentum now, because the banks do really commit themselves. Now in the Netherlands we managed to get all the banks, all the pension funds to commit themselves to the Paris Agreement. What was a hell of a job, because all their compliance officers, their lawyers, they felt, don't write anything there. But we managed it, and now they become enthusiastic and say, well, now we have to come up with a plan for the coming 10 years, how we can reduce the carbon in our balance sheet with 50%, 49%. So that are the sort of things are happening, and I see really momentum in the financial sector to push them, to make them, instead of followers, leaders, front runners in sustainable finance. On another level, you can also see that the central banks are changing. Central banks have now created their own institute, central banks in favor of greening the economy. 3 years ago, nobody could have thought about that. This is the most conservative institution in banking, the central bank. But now they see that it's needed that they take up their role. And why is that? Because they see the long-term risk if they don't do anything, if banks don't do anything. So what we are going to do with the hub we create as Club of Rome together with other organizations is to canalize all this initiative, make connections to the European Commission, and we have very good relations there, to the European Central Bank, to the World Bank, to other institutions, and really show that on different levels things have to happen, and make it really insightful what has to happen. And then I think the financial sector can play an enormous important role in changing the economy, because that is what they should really do. And I really feel that is the place where we can also contribute as a Club of Rome, because the bigger systemic questions are very much living here, and that's what you need in this journey. So far, thank you very much.
So don't go too far, Peter, because I want to bring back both you and Timber to join the panel and invite my panelists up as well to get in a back and forth, an encounter. And by just welcoming them all to the stage, we want to bring up Janine Abunadi, who's the executive director at the MIT Sandbox, as well as Clara Vondrich, who's a director of Divest Invest, to Janine and Peter's right. To Janine's left, the interim dean at the business school, Kaushik Shucharan at the UCT Business School, and then to Kaushik's left, also Nokbile Kumalu, or Q, as he's told me to offer it. And I'll take the middle, the empty seat to keep the conversation going. So you all have heard some provocations on trust, on relationships, on values. Who wants to take it away? Dean?
I could start. You know, when you think about rethinking a system, one has to think about what is the system's emergence. Now, we've spoken a lot about, because what we have in a climate challenge is a system that's emerging in a particular way and you want to change it. So if you want to look at the finance system itself, you've got to understand that the current emergence is shaped in the way in which it's creating an unconsciousness about the issues. Because the finance mechanisms and the finance logic is talking about an expectations game that's detached from the real game. And for a long time we've had that, and we've made some progress towards it, but I think there's still a lot of progress to be made to make the finance mechanisms more conscious. And you know, there's multiple experiments. One practical example is we know social and environmental outcomes are important, like social outcomes like early childhood nutrition or early childhood education. Do we know how to put a price to that? Do we know how to put a price to that so that we can pay for the achievement of those outcomes so they benefit the long-term sustainability? And I think if we want to talk about rethinking finance, we've got to start ourselves thinking about how could we focus the mechanisms of finance to bring players together to solve such issues. So, you know, so the system's important to realize that the systems emergence has to be changed, and then you have to understand the system's systemic behavior. So maybe I'll leave it there and I'll pick it up.
Okay. Janine, maybe does that cross with what you're working on at MIT?
Can you hear me?
Should be on.
It is on.
It's
Be on.
on.
Okay.
There you go.
I think so. I have maybe an early perspective, because the work that we do at MIT is primarily work with students that are looking to do something new and innovative. So they really haven't entered this complex system out there, trying to get regular access to regular loans and financing to bigger businesses. They're really trying to get something new off the ground. So the way we do that, and I'll give just a little background about the way we do it. So MIT, for the people that don't know, MIT here is one of the leading universities in the world in science and technology, has had a long history of really moving science research forward, has a tremendous amount of investments in basic research. And over the last, I think, 10 years or so, MIT has also put in a tremendous amount of resources in student entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship was always part of the MIT ecosystem. Faculty and what happens in the lab, the way that innovation and research actually eventually impact people's lives through technology, and not all technology is bad. Technology actually has done some good things for us in the world, is really through entrepreneurship and innovation. But in the last 10 years or so, MIT and other universities all across the US and probably outside of the US have really identified students as a population that needs a lot of attention and very early investment in developing their entrepreneurship skills and providing them with resources in that case. So that's how the program that I'm the director of came about, and I was the lucky person to get to actually found it about 3.5 years ago. And the belief there is that young people are smart, which is well known, but that young people today have the means. It's actually not inconceivable that they will have the ability to get started earlier than our generation. And that's for many, many reasons. That's one of the reasons is that a lot of the technologies are mature now. I mean, you can write an app, you can do a lot of hardware. You don't need the infrastructure, the capital needs that you needed a while ago. You have access to cloud services, you have access to a bunch of shared services that you don't have to build a huge capital. And so that's really important. And the other factor that's also quite important is that a lot of the industries, the traditional industries, have actually outsourced their R&D because that's probably become more efficient. All this huge expenditure in R&D, a lot of companies have realized, let the startups do it. Let the young people who are willing to work whatever 100 hours a week and put in all their sweat in it and take on that risk. Let them do it. They'll do all the de-risking, and when the technology is ready and they've validated kind of what they call the product market fit, then they'll come in and take that technology, acquire the team, and then that ended up being a much cheaper way for them to innovate. So for those reasons, then I think universities thought that we really now have to educate our students so that they're ready to take these innovations forward. How that answers the question of trust. Trust is at the heart of everything. I'll address that in just a little bit, but I want to address particularly because our program funds all sorts of ideas how this ties into climate change. And I think that comes really, again, from the passion of the students. What we rely on is what the students bring to the table and what their interests are. So the more students are interested in climate change and in making an impact, the more we see those ideas, and the more we're able to support those and then enable them to go out there and bring those solutions and really make a difference. Part of what we choose, besides giving funding and so on, is the mentorship piece, is the continuous emphasis that as you develop as an entrepreneur, you develop credibility, and then credibility is so key And it's not important that you go out there and say, I can do this. It's much more important to go out there and say, here's what I need to do to learn ABC. I don't really know what those are. And help me, you as the elder, find out where I need to get to so you can invest in me if you have a fund or you're a company that I need to sell my new product to. You need to develop a way to develop that credibility that you're going to be able to deliver, and you're going to be able to know what you need to learn and what you need to prove along the way, and just really be honest about what it is that you need to do and how you're going to get there.
So useful innovation is, I think, a space that Nkbile knows really well. So you want to talk about what you're doing at Reimagine South Africa?
Sure. Is this thing on? Okay. Yeah.
You're ready.
Hi. First of all, thank you for this wonderful opportunity and to be on this esteemed panel. I think before I give context to what it is I do, I think it's really unfortunate, and don't misinterpret what I mean here, that Janine even has a career in innovating businesses that would have been unheard of 40, 50 years ago, because that's what we've always been doing. We've been investing in businesses for years. When the Dutch East India Company came from the Netherlands to the southern tip of Africa, it was pension provident funds that invested in greenfields technologies. Yet today, someone will say to you, we don't invest in greenfield technologies, but we do investments. So there's a need here to evolve the finance sector. We are in stasis. We are stuck in Newtonian mechanics when the rest of the other fields have moved into quantum mechanics. And we want to use Newtonian mechanics to solve situations in the 22nd century. And that is why I was over there clapping at what David Korten was saying, because it's absolutely true. To me, a finance individual whose last prescribed reading or textbook that they read was a prescribed reading in varsity 30 years ago is not relevant in my reality. And that is the truth. The world is changing, it's much quicker. To answer your question, what it is I do, I was the youngest fixed income manager in this country, 24 years of age when I got approached to do the job. So much so that when they offered me money, I said, hang on, I'm so young, I don't need this. I did it because I was passionate about it. At my disposal, $8 billion. It was easier for me to invest in an oil exploration project off the coast of Ivory Coast than it was for me to invest in a business right across the road where a farmer is trying to develop or create an aquaponics farm. As long as there's a situation, we're not talking about anything here. The vehicles that we use are dated. So long as how I measure risk is determined by interest rate and determined by how Jerome Powell feels on the day he wakes up, or Kuroda, Marconi, that is not what we're talking about here. The conversation today is about how it is we need to define or redefine return on investments. And return on investment for the first time in the world, and that's the conversation I believe we're here to have, needs to be the quality of air we're breathing, the quality of our water, quality of education, equality for females. How are we tilling the land? Very, very important. So it's amazing that, it's so normal for us to have Janine, who's essentially trying to say, listen, we recognize that these businesses are not getting support, so we need to create these innovation hubs where we incubate these businesses. That is abnormal. That is not normal. So that's my thoughts on this. So I think it's very important that we start posturing and talk about what it is that we need to do.
And I couldn't leave the last for the best, or the best for last, or however that phrase goes, but no more important person thinking about what you just said. How do we rethink and redefine ROI than I think what Clara's doing? You want to tell us a little bit about that and how it crosses some of these things at Divest Invest?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So I have a story to tell you about how young people, who we're all celebrating here, have not only rethought or reimagined finance, but they're working to transform it. And they're doing it through a mechanism that was actually really conceived and blossomed in this country, and that was the tactic of divestment or boycott during the apartheid era. So something that Janine said was very important. So the reason climate is becoming so live in her conversations is because this is what the young people want to talk about. So about a decade ago, young people, frustrated at the lack of speed and urgency with which their elected officials were treating this crisis, decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. The climate talks had failed in Copenhagen. The Waxman-Markey climate trade bill, climate cap and trade bill in the US had stalled, and everybody was left scratching their heads. What have we done wrong? Why are these top-down solutions not working? And so a few kids on the Swarthmore College campus in the United States organized the first ever coal divestment campaign. They took a play from the anti-apartheid playbook, and they decided they were going to tell their university endowments that to be morally just at this age of climate change, they had to divest from the companies that were undercutting the future for the students they thought to support. I mean, this was so foundational. How could you be an institution of higher learning and yet fund the destruction of the planet? So that was in 2011. Fast forward to 2019. This movement that was launched by a handful of college campuses is now a global, hydra-headed, transformational juggernaut, for lack of a better word. There are thousands of divestment campaigners around the world that are working on this issue. And last month in Cape Town, actually, we hosted a summit where we announced that 1,000 institutional investors, I'm not talking about individuals, but actual institutions like banks, insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, over 1,000 have now made some form of divestment commitment. And those institutions collectively manage assets of $11 trillion. So this is real money, and the shift is happening. It's so ironic, though, for me, because I was just, clapping internally and externally when David Korten was talking about the need to foundationally transform our economic system, this dis-ease that we all have for more, constantly striving to, consume more, develop more, have more. This is the bedrock problem, and we have to change it. And yet I find myself sitting in the sort of nexus of finance and the economic system, and it made me realize that I have a foundational discomfort with working in this particular space. But then I realized also that these young people are actually not only working within the system, they're working to disrupt it. And two very concrete ways they're doing that is that they have reshaped the idea of what it looks like to run and invest a responsible investment portfolio. So one of the key tenets of modern economic theory is what's called modern portfolio theory. This idea that you have to diversify your holdings across all asset classes in order to have reasonable risk-return profiles. But these students were saying for the first time, no, you have to actually divest an entire sector from your portfolio. And many institutional managers said simply, this is insanity, we won't do it, and if you force us to go down this path, we will resign. Many of the big environmental foundations in the US actually, their CIOs said they would walk away if forced to go down the divestment path. Well, it turns out, 10 years later, that not only is the moral case strong, but the financial case is strong too. The oil and gas sector, once the backbone of the global economy, is now an industry in decline. It was the worst performing sector of the S&P 500 last year and was underperforming the rest of the sectors for the last decade. So this idea that you have to diversify into a dying industry is simply bananas. And the institutions that are divesting are proving that they're actually doing good while performing better. I just published a report by the 200 foundations that have committed to divest invest philanthropy. Their returns are outperforming their benchmarks since taking on this pledge. So this idea that you have to choose between values and value is being smashed. And we really do have an opportunity not only to lead from a moral perspective, but to reframe this whole idea of sustainable investing and green investing into simply smart investing. Thanks.
So maybe the big ROI is green and solar, and not 20th century thinking in oil and gas and that kind of thing. I think what we want to do is open up the conversation with the limited time we have to get a few back and forths, because there were many questions raised that I think pertain to everybody up here. So let's just take a few questions if we can. There've got to be some, and if you don't have any, I've got certainly a handful. Here we go, right here, there's a hand down here. Mic is coming around.
Metzelal, I'm from Ethiopia. I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm basically from Germany and Ethiopia. And I create companies in Ethiopia with climate change to make profit from SDGs. So one of the biggest challenge we face, and actually that's the reason I came, because I thought you might answer it, is because the highest population in my company are youth. The Ethiopian youth, like them, they ask, they don't need a big amount of money for investment. Innovative investments we created are only for very highly educated postdoc or doc. And those ones, I'm sorry to say, they're not willing to go to the countryside and do the job. So, but I'm not begging because we don't want to ask money. What the challenge we have is actually the last 10 years, we didn't only provide environmentally sustainable products to the international market, but we did accumulate also carbon segregations, 93,000 tons. And we were promised by the world that they will buy us, which they didn't buy us. So we are now, I'm in a situation in Ethiopia where I'm trying to create a sort of environmental venture capital or private equity, whereby we will invest, we are interested to collect the money and reinvest it into our environment by giving jobs to the youth. But our challenge is creating this fund because unfortunately Ethiopia or other African countries, the value, the trust they have in the world market of finance is almost zero. So we are cut between the two systems, even though I have to mention that the European market is a very spoiled market, so you cannot sell. I mean, Africa is a bigger market for our environmental products, to be honest, than Europeans. But Europe has got still in hand on the fund issue, being the one who says A, B, C. But at the same time, I'm an Ethiopian company, which I have. So I'm looking for solutions. Not that I'm interested that you give us money, but I'm interested to find a system because we value the carbon segregation we made. It is valuable also, whether it is acceptable or not. But we also provide products and services which we generate money. So we need another understanding of financial transaction in our own funds, and I would be very interested to know your opinion on that. Thank you.
I think maybe that's a thought of solutions from Themba, perhaps. Do you want to speak to that?
Certainly. I mean, the part I didn't touch on, I'm on the second business, major business that we're working on. And the first business was motor insurance. And a lot of people do ask, why did I partner with a big player such as Discovery in this country? And it goes back to the point you were making, Janine, about credibility. As much as the idea was valid, and I mean, you can see even the numbers since I had left the business, it's valid, it's producing numbers, but you needed credibility. No one buys a story purely on the basis of a presentation. And that credibility I created for myself by working with the tried and tested in the market, by having gray hairs around the table who have done the work. The Enthovens that were mentioned yesterday in the remarks when they were thanking their contribution to this conference, they were co-investors with Discovery or Discovery Insure when we started. So there was credibility because they've been in motor insurance as far back as 1986. So it was not a spray and hope that the business was going to succeed. The point I'm trying to amplify, including now the work we're doing on the second business that I'm doing, the credibility, that you bring along, the people you partner with, that have been on the ground, that have got that trust with potential funders, where you've closed the trust deficit, it's what actually catalyzes ideas. That's what gives ideas impetus. And that's been my first-hand personal experiences. And I think, Janine, you can talk about it quite a little bit, but the reality is what the students that you deal with, they need anchor points that become enabler and build confidence bridges for them to be able to have that funding. And I think the university is doing that. So within the context of your PE fund, certainly it becomes useful to find the right level of gray hairs in the field that have walked the field raising capital for such initiatives, because then they know that you are not taking chances. And that would be my first-hand personal experience, is that I know it takes long, but with a bit of patience, and a lot of people would argue with me, particularly on Discovery in Shore, it was a 7-year patience journey. But eventually, I built the kind of credibility that was required. Launched the business is worth a lot more than the 7 years that I lost.
So before we come to the panelists, million hands in the back, all the way to the back, and we'll take maybe 2 questions to get a few. Go ahead.
Lena Anderson from Denmark, and this is more of a comment, because Denmark is one of the countries where we have the highest level of trust. And I think it's highly overrated, because the important thing is responsibility. And when you have a lot of responsibility, then you can have trust. But it's easy to measure trust, because you can ask people, how much do you trust police officers or politicians or media or whatever? It's harder to ask people, are you a responsible person? Because everybody would probably say yes. So, and you're already touching upon this now with credibility. I think we should be talking much more about responsibility than talking about trust. So that was just a comment. But thank you very much for a very good panel.
Over here in the middle, right there. Absolutely. And let's make it a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to challenge the audience.
My name is Hawa Bibi Khan. I'm part of the first generation of black investment professionals, and I would like to acknowledge my fellow pioneering colleague in Toby, who's running a very successful asset management company. My question is rethinking finance. What is that in the context of Africa? Who is it that we're talking to? We have 70% of this continent that is in the informal economy. Yeah. So how is that finance? How are we unpacking that, rethinking that, to talk to that sector of the African community based on what our sister here from Ethiopia was asking? The second is in the context of South Africa, with the history of apartheid, etc., we have to then rethink finance, because workers' savings, the lady from Sweden was talking about trust, but we have to talk about responsibility. So in the context of the history of our country, where workers' savings were used to build a minority economy, the role that insurance companies played in pooling savings to build a minority economy, that when we got freedom, there was disinvestment and deindustrialization in our country, and a lot of that capital moved to the rest of the world, more so to the Western world, etc. So I chose to attend today because I wanted a deeper dialogue narrative coming through in the context of rethinking finance in the African context and in the different asset classes like infrastructure, the renewable energy spaces, basic things like affordable housing, because most countries in Africa, we don't have a vibrant financial system to create mortgages for people to be able to take advantage of that. And we know, for example, that housing is an enabler for economic activity, for stabilizing a society, etc. So my question again is, what is rethinking finance in the African context? Thank you.
Clearly some interest from the panel. Mamphela, please.
I think absolutely, so those two are very much linked. Great context, great question. So because what we do with the informal sector is we put up arbitrary things like credibility. And we say, if you don't have audited financials or you don't have a particular amount of turnover, yet every company starts at that level. So how do we then say we need to put those barriers up for the informal sectors? That's the sort of thing that we need to do. So in terms of how do we rethink finance, well, how I've done it is I've committed to, well, I'm a financial engineer now, and so it's about creating smaller ticket sizes, because guess what? The lady who's trying to build her small business isn't looking for 100 million rand. They just want 500,000 rand so that they can go from employing 4 people to 10, which is a real impact. Whereas in the developed economies, those companies are largely at economies of scale. They're all downsizing. And we have a shortage of jobs in our country, and particularly the informal sector is affected the most. So it's downscaling the product, retrofitting, and you know, it's what Mr. Fukutake was saying. The instruments serve us. We don't serve the instruments. If the instruments don't work for the context, we need to change the instruments. And that's what we're experiencing. That is why there is that deficit.
Janine, you wanted?
Yeah, I would like to add to that, in some sense, the connection between an MIT type kind of education where we have really amazing African students, amazing students from Latin America and from the developing world in general, and what their role is in answering that question. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have a company that came out of the Sandbox Innovation Fund who is looking at, for example, how would Uber drivers get access to loans, because Uber driver, that's the new economy, and you know, a lot of people are using Uber as a way to make an income. If their car breaks down, they're done. So partly in Brazil, this was the first market they looked at was Brazil, is how can an Uber driver get a loan at a reasonable rate so when the car breaks down, they're not out of business. And what they did is started collecting their history of driving and using that as a way to assess whether this person is going to be able to default, be able to pay their loan or default on their loan and be able to get them lower interest rates. So you have this high-tech company that's doing usual kind of risk assessment, taking advantage of all sorts of data that they can get access to. And then we have another company that came out and is operating in Pakistan, also helping farmers get access to loans by leveraging data that they collect. They take pictures of their farms, of their crops, and they try to leverage as much data as they can in order to help the usual institutions to provide them with the loans or the insurance at rates that are reasonable that allow them to actually run their small businesses. So there's a way that this kind of, you know, what happens in these high-tech universities or new business models can help the small businesses in Africa and Latin America and Asia.
Great, and I know Peter was going to jump in, please.
Yeah, we have been investing in banks in Africa to help them to develop, and what I have come across, that they are much more advanced in mobile banking than in Europe. So it's not always that they are catching up, and sometimes to make the big jump, where Europe I can see from very close, it's really trying to catch up. And I think that's very promising. So we have to look for jumps, really see where you can sort of skip a whole telephone network, go to mobile banking, immediately combine it with banking. That is where I think the innovation is, and where people can immediately benefit from.
Great. There were more in the middle. A couple more hands. Let's come down front, all the way in the first row. And I'll do the honors. Might as well. Here you are.
Hello, thank you so much for such a stimulating conversation about finance, and I think this is something a lot of the young people in the room today have been discussing and sharing. My question is also written down. I'm also a social entrepreneur. My work has been in Tanzania in agribusiness and women economic development based on supply chain work. So research suggests that there is about 2.2% of VC funding that women actually have access to. Now, minority women and women of color have a much slimmer chance to access these type of resources and funding. It's because they are often questioned about preventing losses or protecting their potential businesses against competition, whereas men, particularly white men, don't get the same type of interrogation. Banks also have shown to apply much higher interest for minority and black women in these situations. And for African female founders, research showed that the racial and gender wealth gap, in addition to the negative bias that has been perpetuated, has continued this lack of access to networks, and it created even further bias to barriers to access funding. So my question to you is, what is being done, as the woman in the back asked, to improve the access for funding and resources for women in the African context, but also for minorities? And I would love to hear a very specific and concrete example of what is being done.
Let's take one more right behind.
There's the girl in the red, too.
What's that?
There's a girl in red back there.
Okay.
She's been popping her hand up over and over.
Oh, great. And then
Thank you so much for the wonderful insights. My name is Edgar Okech. I'm from Kenya, and I've kind of wallowed from political space to civil society space to the private sector, trying different things to help fellow young people to build businesses. And therefore, my question is a little bit political. How do we unlock lazy, scared capital in the investment space to support emerging, amazing initiatives in the African continent? And the reason why I say this is because in wallowing, trying to do a number of things, I've realized that the financial space is quite binary, very generally so. You find that there is a lot of philanthropic dollars or rands or shillings whose basket is very small, and many initiatives that are amazing that could change people's lives are competing for those vis-a-vis the other basket in the investment space, which is so scared of many risks in the African continent, yet sitting lazy, and nobody can access it, and there's so much more of that money, and therefore many initiatives tend to reinvent themselves to compete for this smaller basket as opposed to the bigger basket. So I'm very curious, especially from Peter and Clara, how do we unlock this lazy, huge, scared capital to support this wonderful initiative? Thank you so much.
That has to be a meme. You have to create it. It's brilliant.
Okay. And then maybe just add a third one in the back. I've been missing here in the red. Last one, back there, all the way.
Yes, you.
That's right.
Yep.
Thank you very much. My name is Megan Sager. I'm a sustainable finance consultant who has spent the last 10 years working with banks and other financial institutions to find ways to channel capital at scale into sustainable infrastructure and housing. My question to you relates back to one of the opening speeches today around the massive disruptive decarbonization that's required to sustain good quality human life on this planet. What are the financial mechanisms or pricing signals that in your view would enable a very imminent, rapid decarbonization that is required within the next 5 to 10 years? Perhaps the greatest hope, green bonds have only just reached about 5% of global capital under responsible investing policy. 10 years ago it was carbon markets that didn't last. So what is going to bring that change in the financial sector? How much hope do we have that capital will flow at scale into decarbonization immediately?
So I've got several folks saying they love to respond to it. So let's start with Clara. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your question. It's exactly the right question to be asking right now. So what's really exciting is that divestment is just one of 3 key strands that is really tightening the noose on the fossil fuel industry. That is not only the culpable sector for pumping gases into the atmosphere, but also the one that's been systematically buying out new patents for alternative technologies, blocking at the state level in the US anyway, the progress of laws that would make, for example, net metering possible so people can get paid for their solar power, blocking climate action on so many levels, local, regional, national, global. So in disinvesting from this industry, you automatically open the doors to investment in the green solutions, climate solutions that we know we need. But it's just one of 3 key trends. The other trend is that we see banks increasingly withdrawing lines of credit to the fossil fuel industry. So I'm part of this fossil-free EIB campaign. So we have the European Investment Bank is poised to adopt the first fossil-free lending policy, which would actually halt all new investments to fossil fuels by 2020. It's a really radical, amazing proposal. Ironically, Germany is the one agitating in the background right now, trying to block it because it wants to eke out protections for natural gas. So this is a really important campaign. If you can get involved, I'd be happy to give you some tools and ways that you can intervene. But so the banks pulling out financing, the investors pulling out capital, and then the third big one is insurance companies. So we have over 24 insurers around the world that have now not only divested from fossil fuels, but they're committing to stop underwriting coal projects. To date, it's only coal projects. We're working on oil and gas soon. So when you have investments, lending, and insurance pulled from the industry, it hits a wall. It simply hits a wall.
So how are we going to wake up the lazy capital? And what about concrete examples on women and minorities? Thoughts, Peter?
Just one addition to what Clara said is that we are working now very hard on the platform carbon accounting for financials. That sounds very technically, it's an accounting methodology, but it is that banks are becoming transparent, revealing how much carbon is in their balance sheet. You can manage all those loans, you can measure the carbon, what is there. And I think we have 55 banks now worldwide, this is a start, who are committed to reduce over the next 10 years the carbon in their balance sheet. Now that sounds 10 years far away, but 50% in 10 years is for banks quite a lot, and they get very nervous about it. And they really feel if more banks are going to do it, I can probably go to my customers and say, sorry, I wanted you to reduce your carbon, but you don't. Maybe we have to say goodbye to you, divest from you as a customer. So I think through the reporting and through the transparency, the NGOs who will watch that very carefully, I think we can get a pressure on banks to decarbonize their assets and reduce it. So there is a website and everything else. If you talk to banks, refer to it. 55 banks, also larger banks, ABN AMRO, already committed to that. So I think that's a quite important development. On the women and finance, we have done quite a lot in microfinance. And there is an overwhelming and strong presence that women are much better debtors than men. So, and we love that as a bank. So, but the issue is sometimes that the legal framework in a country requires the signing of the husband, what makes it difficult to deal directly with only the woman. So it's quite a complex thing to say, well, why are women not having more access to money? It depends a lot on the local legal. And I'm very proud that our Queen Maxima, is working very hard on behalf of the UN to get exactly this framework better, so that banks who believe that women are better debtors, I mean, that's actually how it is, that they can really facilitate them. So the numbers you were mentioning, I'm not quite sure if they're for the whole market or a specific market, specific countries, but in general, that's actually more positive what I have experienced than you brought. So that's hopeful.
That's for capital, not microfinance. Yeah. Talking about women founders and not women on the community level. Yeah. Could
be. Yeah.
So, Timber, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on venture capital, it's also geographically defined in terms of, I think the number you gave us is an aggregated number. But if you look at our South African market as an example, having chaired a number of committees where we needed to push the insurance industry to be able to channel funds to the youth, not just women, but to the youth and to women, so that we demonstrate progress in the economy. The reality is, obviously it's geographic within the context of where I am, but at a global level, perhaps there are also other campaigns that need to take place to drive this agenda. Certainly my view is that it commences with some of us around the room. Wherever you've got access and influence, you use it. In my case, when I was the chair of that committee, I made it a point that all the insurers, all the CEOs of the insurance industry, they signed to that agreement, and that agreement is being implemented. To the extent of how that becomes a success or not a success, we'll see as time progresses. But they've put pen to paper to show their commitment.
So I think I'll give one specific answer, even though I'm facilitator. I think of Maya Horgan's fund on the VC side. So she's Swedish, Nigerian, been building out her fund. So that's one, you said concrete, so that I'll give you that. I think we've got time for maybe five more minutes, I think. So let's take a few more questions.
Nobody answered the lazy capital question.
Lazy capital. But we'll come to that, but let's go to the back and then over to the left. And we'll come back. We won't leave out lazy capital.
Lazy scared.
Lazy scared capital. We won't
Still
leave out
sleeping.
in the back, and then we go to the left. Go ahead.
So I'm Will Senior from Accra, Ghana, and Q and Clara really speak to some of the things I believe in. If I nodded any more, I'll be a lizard, I guess. But the point is,
What did you say?
For Clara, some of what you say is really refreshing and it hits home really well. My only question, and this is just pure conjecture, and correct me if I'm wrong, how nuanced is the kind of divestment whole movement when it comes to making sure that Africa doesn't catch the short end of this particular stick again? Because there's a direct connection between finance and technology and who gets commercial value. So for example, when we are talking about the entire continent has less IP than, say, the country of Belarus, right? So given how much capital is going to be tied to technology as we move forward in this whole environmental change that we are trying to see, is there a likelihood that we may be creating commercial value that again doesn't give Africa the opportunity to grow with this global movement as well? So if you say that we should divest from fossil fuels and all these things, how much of the commercial value that is generated from divesting will come to developing economies? And how can we make sure that we can hedge against the potential of deriving commercial value from these developing economies without having technical capacity that is tied to them creating their own technology and also getting some of that commercial value out of it?
Okay. It was over on the far left there in the back. I think it was Ian.
Thanks, Michael. Could I just make a small plea? What I don't hear in this discussion is a real understanding of the risks that climate change now represents.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we only have a very limited space of time to see massive change in the energy systems and in fact, right through society. And what we're seeing, despite all the good work that's going on and the initiatives with financial institutions and otherwise, the fossil fuel investment vastly outweighs that coming from renewable and low carbon solutions. And unless we find a way of really speeding this entire process up, the events will just get away from us. So I just wonder if the panel has any thoughts on how you might actually change the framing of this whole issue to take that into account in the conventional sort of financial considerations.
Look, so I mean, to link it to your question with the lady asked in front here, you know, our concrete example is literally what we do when we measure the risk of a business is we measure how carbon neutral it is. That's it. We don't look at any other measure. And I wanted to link it to a comment that I wanted to make. We need to move away from using terms like this is a green fund, this is a sustainability fund. It is the only way to invest. So that's where the conversation needs to go. These are not green bonds, they're the only bonds. They're not pollution bonds, they're the only bonds. Because if we want to meet our targets, that is how we need to look at it.
So on the changes in the climate, as an industry, particularly the motor and household and buildings and industrial property insurers, one of the key studies that have taken place there is to understand what happens if you reach 1.5% increase in your temperature. What happens when you get to 10%? And sadly, the results are very catastrophic. So the industry is using whatever tools at its disposal to engage with regulators, particularly the finance regulators, and to engage with the power utilities. In our case in South Africa, unfortunately, the Green Geyser program didn't take off for numerous reasons. But you can see that the effort that is being driven by the industry CEOs is to push and change that laissez-faire attitude about, can we now incorporate the Green Geyser program and have rebates from the power utility? The reality is that it's complex, but also there are political undertones. I think there was a comment here about political dimensions that must be taken into account when you make decisions. Those political undertones also talk about the transformation of the economy. And I know it's an isolated example which is applicable within the South African context, but as insurers and reinsurers globally think about how climate change is going to affect the properties that are insured, there is a push and a nudge to try and change the status quo so that there is more acceptance that when you have to replace your geyser, you can replace it with a solar geyser, as an example. When you need to think about coverage of the properties in the coast, there are certain minimum standards which are green and which are friendly to the environment that must be taken into account. So there's a lot of work. It's unfortunate that it's obviously not in the public domain, but for the very same reasons that you need to get the buy-in of the regulators, you need to get the buy-in of the players in the industry. It is impossible for it to be in the public domain.
Let's do the lightning round.
Oh, yeah,
because we're near the end, but
So,
30 seconds on how we
Ian,
accelerate.
One of the most important things that we're working on right now is there's a $34 trillion juggernaut known as the Climate Action 100 Plus. And this is a group of really powerful pension funds, institutional investors that believe they can change the fossil fuel industry through the process of shareholder engagement. So through their ability to sit down at the table with the likes of Exxon and Shell, they will somehow make these, the leaders of the clean energy revolution. The divestment movement is calling BS on that. And we are now in the process of coming out with a declaration that will challenge the members of the Climate Action 100 Plus, some of the most influential investors in the world, to either adopt Paris-compliant shareholder engagement, which would mean demanding an immediate and urgent wind down of the industry with an immediate end to capital expenditures for new exploration. We already can't burn 3/4 of what's in the ground. How are we going to pay billions of dollars every year for exploring for more? It's nuts. So this is a really important intervention because we believe that this well-intentioned shareholder engagement community with trillions of dollars is actually providing cover for the industry to continue its deceit and delay. To the question in the back, this idea about, will Africa suffer unintended consequences from this movement? This is a very live discussion. So many people say, if we just divest from large-scale monopoly fossil fuel companies and invest in large-scale monopoly renewable energy companies, we will have just recreated the beast. This isn't real change. So it's a very powerful discussion, and I actually, based on the Cape Town summit that we had in September, have organized a working group to discuss climate-just investment principles. So if you'd like to be part of that conversation, I welcome you. Similarly, to your point about the slow, stupid, patient, idiotic capital. So basically, the foundations that I work with are very interested in, many of them are interested in community-based climate change solutions. And so they are looking for opportunities and investable opportunities that are at the nexus of, real change happening on the ground, not the large-scale renewable energy projects, but rather community-based solutions. So there's a huge appetite. The job now is to basically connect the entrepreneurs, those that are advancing these solutions to these funders. And if there are particular linkages that I can make, I'm happy to do that.
How are we going to accelerate, Peter, in 30 seconds? Don't run the whole gauntlet, or else we
She
won't
had
leave
more.
this.
She had more.
Okay, go ahead.
And just on Ian's question, I share with him the concern that it's not going fast enough, but it's a subtle process. Unfortunately, if you push too much, you slow down. That's my experience. If you push the bankers too much, they start to become defensive. You have to sort of test the pain. How much pain can they have? And how do they look at things? They look at things like, can I explain it to my shareholders, to my coworkers? What are my colleagues doing? It's all a collective sort of experience. And if you get them together, like we did with the climate agreement in the Netherlands, suddenly when they took that hurdle, now they're talking much differently about it and share more. So it's quite, I cannot make it nicer than that, but it's quite a psychological process and a group process you have to take care of. If you push too much, they all go in the defensive mode and they say, wait, well, that's your opinion, but we think that's our responsibility not, and so forth and so on. It has to become their responsibility, but a joint responsibility. So that's a quite important tactical aspect of the whole question, what is not easy.
Janine, 30 seconds.
From my perspective, working with startups trying to enter and impact this space, what I'm going to walk away with is, instead of just having the slide of talking about what their environmental impact is to do it in the context of this deadline and see whether they can get, whatever their innovation is and their deployment time frame can actually have a slight positive impact towards heading in the right direction.
Kaushik.
I would just want to offer that, there's a few questions we didn't quite get to, especially the unlocking of lazy capital and how do we get funding to real community-based projects. But watch and stay close to the work people are doing with social impact bonds and green bonds. We shouldn't be calling these things but to delineate, because what you're really trying to create is you're trying to create a mechanism by which you can get funding to flow to these projects and communities, but also to manage the outcomes so that they're kept on target in a way. So you're designing a virtuous circle of impact and funding flowing towards the impact. So those are interesting experiments, and nobody could say how much they will go to changing a lot of the way capital markets work.
Right. For me, I think it's consolidation of ideas. Lady mentioned media. Someone else is research institutions. Once we start to consolidate these ideas and ideas that economists put forward, and once we start to talk in one single language, I think we'll start to reach critical mass, or we'll get a whole lot closer to reaching critical mass. We can't still be talking about shareholder value maximization. We need to talk about stakeholder value maximization. But at the same time, it's important to realize that these are big ideas. You're going up against giants. I mean, the person who forwarded shareholder value maximization is a Nobel Peace Prize winning economist. So we need to get our ducks in a row if we're ever going to win this situation. Because right now, we're all talking in different languages, they're just bonds. The only way to invest is this way, the sustainable way.
And that's how we're going to do it, the sustainable way. Round of applause for the panelists, folks. Thank you so much.
Thanks to the moderator.
And then a closing remark as I do the gifts.
Thank you so much. While you're doing the gifts, I'm going to ask the panelists also to move over here, and for the next panel to please come over here and get fitted with your microphones. Please do not leave for an official break. I'm only going to allow you to go for a comfort break if you absolutely must leave. But we only have about an hour and 15 minutes left. We will be running a bit over. But I'd like to thank Michael for doing such a good job. Michael, can you please get your panelists off the stage?
Could you ask for the two?
Yeah. And could I please have Singugu Zukulu, Wanjiku Mwagwiru, and Tiara Dongi? Good for you. Carlos, I'm going to just say a few words, if I may, when I introduce you. About, or were you going to talk about emergence from emergency? Okay, fine. Then I don't need to do it.
hear from the youth group and some of the lessons that we can do in between our meetings, not at the meetings only. It has to be a continuous engagement. Yeah.
I've been talking with Vuyo about that.
Yeah, I need 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, can I please ask you to take your seats? There's some who believe that democracy is broken and a dictatorship is the only thing that's going to work. I don't completely believe that, but the fact is sometimes it does work. So please, please, please take your seats.
And get the people in.
And help me get people inside. Our lovely panel deserves your attention. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our esteemed member of the Club of Rome, a very good friend, my dear friend Carlos Alvarez Pereira, who's been working very hard with us at the club to solidify a very important narrative. You've heard about the sense of emergency in terms of our planetary tipping points. You've heard about the sense of having to absolutely finance change and change finance. You've heard about the need to reclaim our economic system and to ensure that we move beyond the usual indicators of GDP. And now what you're going to hear about is a very important part of our story, which is the story also that we heard in Africa and in South Africa when we talked about trying to create a vision, a North Star that would get us out of apartheid. In order to get us out of emergency, we must emerge towards something else. This final panel will set some of the stepping stones, some of the new thinking around how we actually address this need for a new civilization, a low carbon, net zero, new economy that reflects people, planet, and prosperity. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sandrine. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Africa for welcoming us so warmly in our way back home to transform Club of Rome in Club of Home, as Sandrine rightly said this morning. As a Spaniard, I feel very much at home in this place, in this area. Also because, it looks so much like, it's extremely different, but it looks so much like Andalusia, Al-Andalus, the region of the south of Spain, which, by the way, some centuries ago was brought to the highest level of civilization by Africans. Let's remember that, and let's recognize, and let me give also my thank you for that, for the civilizational role that Africa had in Spain, which, as you know, is the country in Europe the closest to Africa. So, before leaving the floor to my colleagues in the panel, I would like to give some few provocations about why this emerging new civilizations initiative exists, besides the fact that we decided it to exist 1 year ago in Rome. Some of my colleagues, and I don't disagree with them, that's one aspect of it, would say that this is the plan B, just in case the plan A, don't work. Just in case all the calls to emergency, which are rightly put on the table, which are much appropriate, just in case all those calls do not move things enough, do not move the decisions of politicians, of investors, of CEOs enough or not fast enough to prevent collapse. So in a way, yes, this is the plan B the Club of Rome has for the future of humanity. But I think it's much more than that. I would say that the Club of Rome has also decided to be, in the 21st century, the Club of Home. If you change an additional letter, it becomes the Club of Hope for humanity. So this is also about bringing a strong message that we have got unwillingly a reputation of doomsdayers, the people who bring the bad news, collapse will happen. But actually, what we do is a lot about creating hope, of the hope which can come, as we say in this beautiful expression of emergence from emergency. A point which is important is that collapse, it has been said this morning, collapse is not something new in the history of humanity. So, and in particular in this continent, you know a lot about Africa, but also about collapse, but also in my country, we know a lot about that. So maybe because I'm a Spaniard, I'm not so far away from the concept of collapse. Maybe I'm more sensitive than others. Because, some centuries ago, we had an empire with the widest geographical scope of all empires in the history of humanity. In the 16th century, the King of Spain was governing places in Europe, in the Americas, a little bit in Africa, not much, but also in Asia. And that was the empire where the sun never set. And still, from that climax, from what many people consider that climax of Spain, it collapsed completely. And the history of Spain has not been a nice one. The history of modernization of the country has not been a nice one. Mainly the 19th and 20th centuries have been a history of suffering, of civil wars, of conflicts. So we also know a lot about that. So we know that beyond collapse, which is something happening many times in nature and in humanity, and our colleague Hugo Bardi has documented that in a very scientific way, we have to push for something else to emerge, for something new to emerge, in case the established institutions do not give the good responses. Another aspect of emerging new civilization initiative is that of humility, recognizing that, as Luvuyo said this morning, language is limited. Our capacity to understand reality, to access reality through our rational mind and our language is limited. There is much more in reality beyond that. And that can be accessed, or the best way we have developed to access that is art. As Mr. Fukutake put very clearly this morning, we have also to play with this. Art not as an entertainment, but art as a fundamental way of accessing reality. And in this sense, we also are listening to other voices, to the voices of art in this emerging new civilization initiative, and knowing that we don't have the responses. As the most famous Spanish poet says, Antonio Machado, "Walker, there is no way, one makes the way by walking." So we have not the responses, we cannot have a beautiful plan to get where we want to get, because there is so much complexity out there. And I will finish with this. This is also about addressing complexity. Because complexity we should find a different word for complexity. We should talk about life, period. because it's about life, and we cannot define life without referring to life. The knowledge about life is to a large extent beyond what we are capable to express, but what we have known, even if we are not able to know everything, what we have known is that living systems, complex systems, living systems change through learning. Somebody said, and that was very true, there is no difference between living and learning. So living systems change by learning and by mutual learning, and this is also why we are here, to learn from many different sources, to learn from Africa, and to engage into dialogues which are not easy when you engage into dialogues from very different perspectives, and sometimes opposing perspectives, to get to the point where you start learning, when you start to have mutual learning. So that's also why ENCI, the Emerging New Civilizations Initiative, exists. And I will finish my words with another citation from Antonio Machado. I will say it in Spanish and try to translate in English. He said, "Hoy es siempre todavía," which is difficult to translate. This is a sentence of 4 words on which books have been written to try to interpret it. My translation is, "Today is forever still." And my interpretation is, the future is open. Let's make the future we want happen, and this is also why ENCI exists. The Emerging New Civilizations Initiative exists. So that said, as an introduction to what we do, unfortunately we don't have Audrey Kitagawa with us because she's been victim of sickness, but we have a fantastic colleague and friend from the Club of Rome who brings with him at least 2 perspectives, that of India, an ancient civilization, and that of the US, where he lives and works and tries to make sustainability concrete and real in a big organization, which is Penn State University. So Paul Srivastava will give us some more insights on Emerging New Civilizations Initiative. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Give me a 3-minute notice.
So, okay.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. How are we today?
Doing
So
great.
I'm Kitagawa. I'm Audrey for the next 10 minutes. And in the tradition of renaming the club, you heard about the Club of Rome, you heard about the Club of Home, and with my Indian heritage, I take you to the Club of Om. So this initiative, the New Civilization Initiative, I have to say, I learned that I was going to replace Audrey on Friday, and I boarded the plane on Saturday. So the thoughts that you're going to hear are not exactly prepared, but I do have a presentation. I'll try to walk you through it. But it's not entirely clear in my mind what we emerge into, what the new civilization can be. So it's all very tentative. And as Carlos pointed out, we are still working through some of the core ideas. When Mamphela asked me to do this, she said, if I could address 2 issues. One is why we need to transition to a new civilization. And second, what would that transformation be like? What do we need to do the transformation? So I've prepared some remarks to address those 2 questions broadly. I want to thank Carlos for his kind introduction. I want to thank Mamphela for having the confidence to put this big charge of defining a new civilization on me with 1 day's notice. And I want to thank the next generation because all I know about Africa, this is frankly my first visit to South Africa, and everything that I know about Africa is through my connections with my own next generation. So my son has been working in Africa for 5 years. He lived in Senegal and Liberia for 3 years and now works in Washington, but his job is still in Africa. And over the 5 years, we've had many conversations that have just simply blown me away in terms of an understanding of what is going on the ground in Africa. And we won't have time to do all the story sharing around what I have learned, but I'll just give you one example of the kind of truths that you can get by being in Africa physically. And that have to be conveyed to your 70-year-old father at some point in life. So the first year that he was here, we were having a conversation in the middle of the year, and I asked him, how are you doing? And he said, oh, everything is fine, except I'm always hungry. And I said, why are you always hungry? You have $5,000 in your bank account. Why don't you go and buy some food? He said, no, Dad, you don't understand hunger. He's telling this to his father, who grew up in a poor village in India. So I said, what exactly does it mean? He says, when I say I'm hungry, I mean my village is also hungry. I can't just go buy food and eat it by myself. And I don't have enough food to share with everybody, so I prefer to just be with them. He was living with an African family at that time in a village in Senegal at the border of Mali. And it sort of opened my eyes to how Ubuntu can be translated. It's not all about me and I and what I'm feeling. It's also about you and others and being part of a community on such a fundamental thing as hunger. And there have been many other conversations such as these over the years, and I've developed a deep appreciation of the differences between my understanding of the world and the reality over here. So I say this rest of the presentation with great humility. If you don't find it relevant, that's understandable. So let me also say as a part of sort of these early remarks that we've heard a lot of very interesting ideas and principles and thoughts about what needs to be done, but I want to change the tone a little bit to action. Understanding is very important, and I sort of have difficulty disagreeing with much of what has happened today. But I want to put a little more attention on how we do things, how do we act to change things that we find ourselves in. So my second part of my presentation will be more about change and action. So I'm going to flash a few slides up over here. Why do we need a new civilization? I have two answers. One is that things have changed fundamentally, and this is the science behind it. On the left-hand side, you see how things have changed on socioeconomic trends of population, real GDP, foreign direct investment. There are dozens of more variables that have been tracked, and these charts all begin in 1750 and go to 2010. I'm not going to give you a big mathematical or statistical lesson. There's only one lesson we are going to draw from this. On the right-hand side, you have Earth system trends, again going from 1750 to 2010, about a 260-year period. And what I want you to notice that in both the socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends, there is one inflection point. And that inflection point is around the 1950s. Something happened around the 1950s that has made all these graphs basically hockey stick graphs. Things are moving steadily, and then things jump. Partly it is the population, and partly it is consumption, production to satisfy that population. But the results on Earth systems are almost immediate and direct. So you see these kind of rises in ocean acidification, in tropical forest loss, in domestication of land, in degradation of terrestrial infrastructure. So we have now come to a point where we are at the edge. We are crossing planetary boundaries, and if we don't want to cross them, we have to create a new civilization. So that is my first answer. We are now officially, scientifically entered into what is being called the Anthropocene, a period in which humans and human activities and social activities and economic activities are what's driving nature. There is no such thing as nature anymore. We are the strongest force of nature. Whether it's the hydrological cycle or the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle or the phosphate cycle, they're not cyclical anymore. We determine when they happen, or sometimes we don't determine, we're just making changes that make those cycles deeply perturbed. So with this kind of force comes a lot of responsibility. We need to move into a different civilization, a different way of being, a different way of living. So we need to change everything around us. The World Economic Forum has recognized this for the last 5 years running. Some of the top risks to humans and to businesses, which is what they are interested in, are risks caused by these disturbances, extreme weather events, and other sustainability risks. The other reason why we need to change is that we are already destroying and have destroyed significant parts of our existing civilization. Sometimes we don't notice it, especially in the area that I come from, central Pennsylvania. There is not that much evidence of what is being destroyed. But if you look around the world, we have destroyed so much that a number of jurisdictions, political jurisdictions or cities, have declared climate emergencies. So you've heard about big cities like London and Vancouver and Sydney declaring climate emergencies. The numbers actually are 1,177 cities. And if you look at the number today, it's probably gone over 1,200 because every day there are dozens of cities declaring climate emergencies. 23 nations have declared emergencies. 7,000 colleges and universities have declared climate emergencies. There are 290 million people now living under emergencies. But declaration of emergencies and action are two different things. So we need to do the declaration first, but then we need to see what are we going to change, how are we going to change our ways of being, and how are we going to create this new civilization. The good news is there is an agreement, there is a global consensus around the Sustainable Development Goals as one solution. So sustainability and sustainable development goals are agreed to by 193 nations, and businesses think they're a $12 trillion business opportunity, so there is a kind of support from the business side. It's not just a political consensus. There is a commercial logic behind it. And I understand they're not perfect. David and I have had this conversation before. There are a lot of contradictions and conflicts embedded in these sustainable development goals, particularly the goal of growth. Acknowledging all of that, I still think that they provide us a systemic way. They give us a concept of what planetary management could look like. We need to get away from managing within country jurisdictions or city jurisdictions, because most of these challenges that we're now facing that deal with biospheres, that deal with the atmosphere as a whole, climate change or changes in river systems or mountain systems, they're not contained within cities or nation states. They are planetary scale problems, and we need a governance system, or at least a way of thinking, that allows us to address them at a systemic level.
Paul.
3 minutes. Okay. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Here's three. I
Sorry
want
to bring the bad news.
I haven't gotten to my main point yet. But so, when thinking about new civilizations, I feel like those 6 blind men of Hindustan who went to see an elephant, and they were all blind. So depending on which part of the elephant they touched, they thought it was something different. I'm sure you'll have heard this story. So the good news over here is that at least we are touching the elephant. We might think it's a snake. We might think it's a rope. We might think it is a fan. We might think it is a tree. But we are touching it. And we are making our own individual efforts to create this new civilization. I see a lot of examples. You are sitting in an example right now. The Spear States, which is doing things very differently from what wineries in Pennsylvania or in the United States do, being very mindful of the land that they are on, and doing it with a social consciousness. They are creating their own new civilization in a microcosm. And there are literally thousands of examples. In the previous organization that I worked for, Future Earth, we documented what we call the seeds of the new Anthropocene. There's a database available of examples where people are trying to do things differently and create their own new civilization. Okay, so moving to action and change, I just want to say one thing, that my job now as the sustainability officer for a major university is to make the university sustainable. So first, to give you a very brief glimpse of what kind of university I teach at. Oops, sorry. So we have 23 campuses in Pennsylvania. They're located in these blue dotted areas all over the state. We have a budget, we have 100,000 students. We have a budget of $6.4 billion, for those of you who want to know how big that is. If we were a country, our GDP would be bigger than 40 other countries. So our budget alone is bigger than 40 countries' GDP. We have 17,000 employees, about 8,000 of them are researchers, faculty members, who have expertise in everything from agriculture to energy to all the sustainability sciences. I came in 2 years ago with a clear mandate from the top to move the university towards sustainability in 5 areas: curriculum, research, operations, the physical plant of the university, student life, and community engagement. And the way we are doing it is we are, from the sanction from the top, we have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as the framework. And we have got every single budget unit to own sustainability for themselves. The sustainability office doesn't do sustainability for the College of Engineering or the College of Business. They have to do it for themselves. We are the consultants, we are the supporters. We can give them resources, both financial and intellectual. And we are hitting all the systems of the university, because it's not just a question of mind change. And I don't think that for a university of this size, with knowledge across, we are the biggest climate research university. We have more IPCC authors than virtually any other university in the world. We know climate change. Our president is a climate scientist. So we don't have to think about mindset. We need to change the systems of the university. We need to change the decision-making processes of the university. So whether it is strategic planning system, we have something called the enterprise risk management system. We have something called the university investment system, which manages almost $10 billion in assets. We have to change the rules and procedures within this. And this is like a knife fight in a telephone booth. You have to tackle every single manager one-on-one. And it does not happen quickly. This is a long haul. It's a 10-year process. We are at the 3rd year of it. But the good news is that we don't get very much pushback. Nobody is telling us this is the wrong thing to do. And I'm saying nobody. Yeah, there are limitations of resources, and you might get only X amount of budget, etc. But nobody is disputing that this is where the university needs to go. So that is the good news. I'll stop over here. There are other ways I can answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So we have more people in the panel bringing certainly different perspectives. Let's practice a little bit of mutual learning. So, Tiara Danji, please, what's
Sure.
your take?
My take, my story.
Whatever you want to share
Fair.
with us.
My name is Tiara Dungy. I'm a PhD student from Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. There is an entire school dedicated to the study of generosity and giving. Please come see us. We have lots of research to share. But I'm here because I was asked to be here. Dr. Ramphele has a commitment to the youth and to new ideas and to pushing agendas that is unparalleled. But her ask is something that reminds me of where I come from. I'm here because my mom disciplined me, her sisters disciplined me, my grandma loved me, and my farming sister over here fed me. That's why I'm here. And discussing new and emerging civilizations, we have to think about what civilization means. So we think it's the most advanced way of doing things. There's civilized, there's uncivilized, there's savage, and then there's modern, all these things. But it's more than that. It is the way we do things. So the way we do things should be the best way of doing things. The way this ties back to philanthropy for me is within my research agenda. It's based on the premise that we need to claim ownership over our own power through generosity, through the relationships we make with individuals, communities, and each other by connecting talent, time, treasure, and testimony through giving. Philanthropy translates to the love of mankind. But oftentimes when we think about philanthropy, especially in conversations like this, we're always talking about, well, where are the big bucks? Where are the big foundations with the money that they can just throw out? They can fix this. We have a huge budget as a university. You guys are probably a nonprofit, right? Yeah. We have all this money. Where is that money when it comes to climate change, right? It's just easy to put money into it. But it's more than just putting money at things because you have it. It's about employing those talents, those things that we hold dear that you can't monetize, putting it towards changing our trajectory that's very important. That's why the Youth Summit was so amazing. We have over 50 young people, academics, entrepreneurs, bosses, government officials that have solutions, have the talent, have the skill, have the energy, and have the frustration to make change happen. And so I encourage everyone in this room, I'm actually going to demand, this is something else that my grandma and my mom did to me, they voluntold me to do things. So I'm voluntelling all of you, meet someone who doesn't look like you, who is out of your age bracket, out of your, whatever is about you that you feel you wear on the outside. Find someone who looks very different and make a partnership with them. Don't just share your name. Don't just share your job title. Make a partnership. We are here to give through relationships. We are here to give through talent, but also money. I'm a fundraiser. I'm on the faculty at the fundraising school at my school. So also open your wallets. Few of you might have a little bit of money somewhere in here, I've heard. And so also don't forget, money is an important part of this. Invest in businesses, invest in the entrepreneurs that are making a difference. We're going to ask for it. We have no shame, and no means nothing. It makes us prettier, so we keep going. So please, meet each other, give each other a relationship, give each other the support we need to continue fighting this fight.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. Actually, we had a little bit of discussion yesterday in a workshop we organized on this activity, Emerging New Civilizations, about how do we engage into dialogues with people who don't see what we see,
It's the only way we can make change.
How do we engage dialogue with Donald Trump?
With Donald Trump.
That would be a real question,
I'm an American, not a magician. I don't know.
No, but seriously, because so many people don't see what we see. So it's not about, it's fantastic to be here and to share with you, but the people here share already a lot in the perspective of what we have to do. There are many more people outside who don't share those views. How do we engage in dialogues with them? So, but I want to give time to our two other participants. Wanjiku Mwagiru. Apologies for the pronunciations, but...
You pronounce it very well, no problem.
Please.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm very, very.
Your ear thing has to be in front.
I need a script. I think put it in place.
I think you have to put it closer.
I'll hold it.
Or use it.
Yeah.
I'll hold it. I got it.
Hold it, yeah. That should be some.
Sorted. It's lovely to be here, and I'm grateful to the Club of Rome for this forum. I'm also very grateful to the IFR, Institute for Futures Research, the University of Stellenbosch, for having partnered with the Club of Rome to bring all of us together. It's wonderful to see a variegated room. It's wonderful. They have some meetings you go to, and you're probably the only black person. I've been to many of those. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Fantastic. So it's lovely to be here and to share the energy that is here. And yes, indeed, welcome home. And you can stay if you feel like. Africa is our heart, H-U-T. It's also our heart, H-E-A-R-T, because we all evolved from here. So you couldn't be more at home than where you are right now. I know I have a few moments, so before I'm shut down by Carlos, I better share what I have in mind with you. I'll start with a quote, and believe it or not, from Victor Hugo. He had a timeless observation when he said, "You can resist an invading army. You cannot resist an idea whose time has come."
Mm-hmm.
African time has been here for a long time. So we cannot anymore evade the recognition that Africa has been here and we are part of it, because it's an idea whose time has been a long time coming. However, we are very patient as Africans. We are patient and we have been waiting, but we do know that our time is here, because our time has always been here. The rest are definitions. Having said that, let me share a few highlights or some moments in my life, if you don't mind. When you wake up to who you are, when you wake up to recognizing that you're born into Ubuntu and you know there's no problem with that. But then one day you go to school and you are told, no, Africa is divided. Africa is carved up into so many parcels and portions as per the night meeting in 1884 in Berlin. And therefore, Africa is carved up. Africa is not carved up. There are no boundaries in Africa, and I would like to share that with you. And let me put that into context. I would like to share that with you because I am privileged for having had the opportunity, whichever way it came to me, to work in every country in this continent except the Northwest, the Maghreb part of the world. But in all other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, I've set my little feet. And I was home wherever I went. And there's one thing I discovered. There are no boundaries in Africa. If we can just, all of us as Africans and the world, recognize there are no boundaries. I would drive in a truck in Togo, and the person driving me would say, to our left of a small truck in the middle of the forest is Ghana. To our right is Togo. And then you realize, actually, what we do as we've always done, we cross boundaries because there are no boundaries, because we belong. And anybody else who does not come from Africa also belongs. So that has buoyed me up. And that has really taught me the experience of knowing that we have always been on the correct trajectory. Because you cannot carve up the world and then wake up one day to say, oh no, we are all one. We have recognized from time immemorial, you cannot especially carve Africa into pieces. Africa has been here for a long time. But in 1963, when Kenya was becoming independent, I was a very young high school student. I'd just finished my Form 4. We were taught a little song, and it went like this. Africa is shaped like a question mark. Okay, in reverse, of course, the board should be on the right side, on the right side, looking at it from here. But from the left, Africa is shaped like a question mark. And then the next line was, Africa has the answer now. And we felt very proud. In 1963, we were in cloud 9. I will go on to 1968 because I'm an environmentalist, and I recognize that in 1968, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published. It was Rachel Carson's book in 1968 that said, Silent Spring, the world is going to be silent. The birds are dying in the Great Lakes of America because of industrial pollution from agricultural chemicals. So Rachel Carson's book set in motion the environmental movement. And I'm really, really, really glad to be saying it was a woman who did that. We are mothers, and we are part of Mother Earth. So a woman taught the world, you can change your perspective. You can begin to recognize that without the environment, we have no survival. Fast forward to 1972. I'm a very young lecturer at the University of Nairobi. I'm in charge of the course on Africa. And guess what? The Club of Rome, 1972, limits to growth. And in comes sustainability, beyond environment sustainability. Now sustainability was another orange altogether. We had to change, especially after 1972, our whole curriculum. I had to change. I'm an environmentalist, and I had to align my course content with the Club of Rome's limits to growth. So the whole concept of sustainability, the linkages of the environment and humanity are inviolate. Going a little bit forward, in 2000, a new century came in, and there's been a lot of hype. And we are still in that hype. And it's only been 19 years since 2000, but we are already on another platform. Why am I talking about 2000? In context of this forum, will the Club of Rome be able to spring another rabbit out of the hat and give us a theme that can rally the world and unite it so that we have a similar perspective, a shared perspective of our responsibility, not only to ourselves, but to the planet as well? Having said that, I know I don't have much time to go into a lot of other details, but I would like to recognize the fact that the Emerging New Civilization Initiative is a platform upon which we can climb, step up, but we really have to ask ourselves, firstly, what is emerging that has not always been there? What is it going to do to us? When colonization emerged, what did it do to us? What is the next trajectory of the emergence? Will it keep us close together? Will it divide us? Is it all about reaping resources? Is it still about sustainability? Is it still about one Earth, one planet? So as we contemplate on what climate emergency means, we have to contemplate in terms of a long-term survival trajectory, because we have a role to play in cleaning the mess as human beings that we have precipitated on the earth. So I hope that in forums like this, we can all go back to the hearts and the houses and the castles and the schools and the universities we come from, and recognize that in whichever little dot you are on the earth, you have to play your part. We are also living at a time when the individual has a lot of latitude to make their own decisions. We are really blessed. And I know there's a lot of dictatorship all over the world, not just in Africa. A lot of us grew up being told Africa is chaotic, Africa can't govern itself. Hey, but here we are. Here we are. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism and trust and belief in ourselves. We look forward to this journey. And going back to the Club of Rome, I really, really hope. I'm an incurable optimist because I've seen a lot of optimism in my life. I grew up during the Mau Mau when we thought the world was over. There were no schools, there were no families, we were all herded into villages. As a child, we really thought the world had come to an end. Guess what? We emerged, and that emergence has brought me and my daughter Jerry and her two sisters here. So there has to be optimism that we carry on our backs, beneath our skins, and exude it through our pores. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is indeed a journey, a shared journey. So, Sinegugu Zukulu. Again, apologies for the pronunciation.
No, that's correct. That's correct. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sinekuku Zukulu, coming from the Eastern Cape, which is the next province, coming from Poneland in Amadiba. Okay, I've been having lots of questions about what is this. This is my traditional attire from my tribe in Amampondo. I come from Pondoland, and Kwamadiba, which is where the Kolobeni was mentioned here during the opening address in Dr. Ramphele's speech, which was read. And I do have 3 colleagues, by the way, there. I've got Bongega, Pegeni, and Sbu. Please show yourselves up.
Stand up.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. They come from Kolobeni. Okay, before I get carried away about Kolobeni, let me get on to. I would like, with my few minutes here, I would like to to invite you to listen to the voices from the periphery. There are voices out there globally that are not being heard. The voices of the indigenous people on their lands. They are there in the Amazon, they are in the Latin America, they are in the Southeast Asia, they are all over our continent in Africa. And they are saying something about what sort of future we need that would be acceptable. But I do not think we were all listening. We were created to have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a good reason, so that we listen more and talk less. So, and I'd like to say that's the voice that I would like to bring to the fore in this conversation now. For instance, we have heard about the Standing Rock in America, where the people were fighting to protect their homes, their livelihoods, their waters. We have recently, I'm trying to say to you, things are not okay. There is something wrong with the current development trajectory that we are pursuing as a global community. We have just heard now in the news that the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And if you, for instance, globally, all of these recent years, we have heard that environmental human rights activists are being murdered. Who are coming from the indigenous communities who are fighting to protect their homes, their livelihood, their lands. For instance, if I were to look into figures, in 2014 alone, 116 of those leaders were murdered. In 2015, 185, 3 leaders every week. In 2018, 164 of these human rights activists were being murdered for standing up to protect their homes, their livelihood, the health of this planet. Is the world listening to them? So therefore, we need to listen, because those people, they have got a message for us all, a message for governments, a message for corporates, a message for transnational cooperation to say what sort of future they want on their lands. Who were being implicated in the murders and assassinations of these people. Mining companies, logging companies, agribusiness, those huge corporations. So therefore, what sort of future, what sort of development trajectory we need in these spaces? Indigenous people all over the world are holding a key in terms of adaptation to climate change. They have the solutions which we seek, but when people meet in those COPs, how many of those voices are being heard? How many of those voices are brought to the fore? How many of those voices are being listened to? We need a development that promotes justice and democracy. We must embody the indigenous knowledge system of those indigenous communities because they know what is best and what is good for their lands. And the development that will be sustainable, I mean ecologically sustainable, is the one that will be drafted with and by those people themselves because they know better in terms of their needs. They know what they want to improve in their lives. We need a kind of development trajectory. We need a kind of future that embodies the principles of FPIC, the free, prior, informed consent. People must be given. If we were in a global village that listens to the aspirations of the indigenous people, we would not be having all of these matters. Because corporations, governments are not willing to listen to those voices. As a result, the people get eliminated, assassinated, in order to remove those peripheral and vulnerable voices. So, governments, corporations, transnational corporations need to abandon the Father Christmas syndrome, where they know it all. They come laden with what they think is good for the indigenous people, and people are then coerced and forced to accept that which has been crafted without them somewhere by people because they know shareholders, they know that they will make more money if they are able to get through that. Public participation is done as a box-ticking exercise. That has got to come to a stop. Father Christmas syndrome must fall and fall now. So the kind of development trajectory we're looking for is the one that is ecologically sustainable. I've said that. Extractive industry is not development. You cannot, when you come to extract that which is on the soil for the benefit of your shareholders, when you come to pollute somebody's waters, when you come to destroy the biodiversity, the natural resources, the ecological infrastructure that people depend on and call that development, that is not development. Maybe I don't know what development is. If we're looking at the SDGs which were mentioned, for instance, once again, in closing, I want to go back to the Kolobeni case. If you want to know more about Kolobeni, you can search that. You can go to YouTube, then Google search Kolobeni. Kolobeni is Xolobeni. And you search, there are lots of films on the struggle of the people of Kolobeni, which is a 20-year struggle. The people saying no to mining, and the government forcing it onto the people. 20 years. It hasn't started. People are determined. People have died, but people are saying no. And when you look at the development that people have said, there are only two acceptable ways we'd like to develop ourselves. They say agroecology or agriculture and ecotourism. And when you look in terms of what they have chosen, if you look at sustainable goal number 1, no poverty. So when they produce their own food, They don't have to be dependent on somebody. They don't have to go and buy food. They produce their own. SDG number 2, zero hunger. So they will have. So they will address that. Goal number 10, reduce inequality. So those people, in terms of their way of life, their culture, they will be able to achieve that. Climate action, when they have their waters, their ecosystem, their ecological infrastructure protected, so they are able to achieve that, they are able to adapt to climate change. 14 is life on land. So when you look at what, this is, I'm mentioning this as an example, but most, if not all, indigenous communities all over the world, the voices, the things that they say, the development they want to see on their land is about achieving these SDGs. But is the world listening to them? No. The world is not listening. I thank you.
Thank you so much. We got from the three of you, we got very strong message. I will come back to them later, but let's practice the recommendation which has been just made. Let's listen to others. So there is one hand there.
My name is John Gilmore. I'm an educator by choice, and I work in the creating opportunities for children in this country who live in very impoverished conditions in the townships. And we have proven that they can go on to university and do very well. But what is key to them doing well is in the refocusing of education, we have to focus on values-driven education. It's been disappointing for me today to not hear the word education. The Club of Rome has no hope if you don't prioritize education. We have a continent of 1 billion people. 50% of the people in this continent are under the age of 20. 2050, there will be 2 billion people, and again, 50% of that 2 billion will be under the age of 20. There is only one way to create a new civilization, and that is through a complete reframing of the way we teach children and the way they learn. The child has to be at the center. The child has to be empowered through emotional development, not just through filling up heads through information. We need a revolution, not just in Africa, because the education of the West has failed Africa and is failing the West. And I think the Club of Rome needs to really be metacognitive and very clear about its position with all of the good thoughts of today, without addressing the fact that so many children on this continent do not have access to school, and those who do have access to school have access to very, very poor education. There are some really exciting solutions possible, but they need deep investment, 20-year timelines that will not come by accident. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a few questions and then we react, please.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentations. This one is directed to you, sir, the last speaker. So, like you were saying, in our communities, I also come from Africa, Zimbabwe. I have my roots, my rural place. And we note that we as our communities, most of them, we have forgone, indigenous lifestyle for urbanization, because when development started in our communities, we felt it was the way to go because we had an eye for development and urbanization, living in a fancy house in a city. And most of our parents or our grandparents started sending their children to school so that they can fetch jobs within the cities and take care of the family at the expense of what? Of nature. So you would notice that our societies, our governments, they come again and they colonize those people. For instance, in my country, the people in the rural places, they are given fertilizers, they are given seedlings so that they can farm. But This is not a bad thing, but then, because somebody's offering something, then you tend to worship them. That's how it normally works, because you're looking forward for something as well. But you will notice that this has actually forgone the indigenous knowledge, which has been the most sticking and lasting knowledge within our communities, because we have some rituals or some activities that we would say, on a Wednesday, you don't go to a farm. You are not allowed to cut trees within an area which is not yours. So this is a question to you. What can we do to gain this momentum back again within the communities? I'm sure we are now few within the rural places. We have displaced as young people. We are no longer investing in our rural communities, whereas we are saying that's where the nature lies, that's where we have the most resources, that's where the big companies are coming to mine at the expense of our communities. And now we talk of indigenous knowledge as if I'm the one who's supposed to come again and teach my elderly the indigenous knowledge, yet it's something that was existing there. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Should I? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Some more questions.
My name is Cormac Cullinan. I'm an environmental lawyer by profession, but I'm also one of the founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. I think this is an incredibly important conversation, because if we don't have an idea of a viable future, we lost. But one of the things that I notice is missing is I think we need a discussion about law and governance, because legal systems are the DNA of society. In other words, they determine how societies replicate. And the DNA we've got at the moment is not capable of replicating of producing an ecologically sustainable society. To give you an example, in the apartheid years in South Africa, people used to say, apartheid is created by laws. That means to get rid of apartheid, you have to change the laws. Laws can only be changed by Parliament, therefore change must come through Parliament. But that route was blocked because only white people could vote. So what happened is that the pressure built up to such an extent that it went round Parliament, and a unique process was created which negotiated a completely new constitution. But that constitution was drawing on visions that had been created as long back as the 50s, the Freedom Charter, which expressed the aspirations of the people for the kind of world that they wanted. Now, what we're seeing at the moment in the world is there's going to be a break like that. There's going to be a dramatic change in many countries. And if you don't have in place a vision about what you want in terms of governance, you won't put in place the right DNA to replicate a future society. And there's interesting stuff happening in the world with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, International Rights of Nature Tribunal, many other initiatives. But I draw attention to the fact that I don't think you can achieve this, that this conversation is not complete unless you talk about law and governance. And I'd urge you to add that to your agenda.
Thank you. So let's first react to...
Okay.
Since there are many questions,
all right.
I'm not sure we'll have time for everybody.
Okay.
Please.
All right. Okay. By sitting here, you must know, I'm just reminding you because you know about this, we have just fallen victims of being here. But in terms of the initiatives and the ideas going forward, it's not only supposed to come from here. It's supposed to come from everyone here, this gathering here. Okay, so that's one thing you must. So when we don't mention something, we have got limited time, but there are people here. We need to mention those things and put them into the pot. Going now to the question of the IKS, it's actually very interesting, gentlemen from Zim. I am part of my advocacy work. I'm busy documenting the indigenous knowledge system. I'm going back and I'm interviewing the elders. We do wilderness trails with the young people. We go and live in the forest with an elder who has got the indigenous knowledge. We are doing programs of promoting the indigenous knowledge system because, unfortunately, our schooling system has not made an effort to promote our indigenous knowledge system. Alistair McIntosh, one of the Irish writers, talks about planting one foot in the past, and then in order to determine your way going forward. Digging, the question you asked earlier on, you asked before, after she's spoken, what is important for all of us is to dig where we stand. If you are an academic, use that platform. If you are a financier, use that particular platform you have to bring about the change that is relevant to this particular discussion. So for wherever you are, so dig where you stand and bring about this meaningful future that we are crafting, that we are talking about here. So it is very, very critical. So the elders who are still there, who are still surviving, need to be given an opportunity to narrate, to tell that, and get that documented, get that written into books, so that as the kids go to school, as they get to university, that knowledge is there, is available, is at their disposal. Make films out of that. So the onus is on us. It's our responsibility as people who realize, who are part of this conversation, to say, hang on, this is our knowledge. This is the African knowledge that is so critical in terms of even addressing the climate change adaptation. So we need that knowledge. So let's bring it to the fore and revive and rescue what we can still rescue. Thank you.
It just so happens that one of our Youth Summit participants is involved in a seed bank that brings native seeds together from around the continent, selling, distributing, all those kind of things. But imagine if we put these stories, with the knowledge, with the people, with the experience, with the systems and with the resources to make it something we can then put into the education. That's why we need to speak to each other. Make sure we understand the human and social capital in the room, because we just solved a giant problem right here.
Yes.
So can I react to
Yes.
I want to react to the comment on education, because I think it's really the fundamental problem, that the education systems that we have, particularly in the state that I am in, and probably all across the United States. So what are education systems, if you think about it? They are mining companies. They mine raw material from villages. In my case, we have 23 mines. That map that I showed you, where our campuses are, we take 18-year-olds from high schools. We train them for the urban market or the global market, and no one goes back to the village. So after doing this for 100 years, what has happened to villages in Pennsylvania? Basically, knowledge has been extracted from them, and those communities have lost all resilience. You see all kinds of social problems, health problems, opioid crisis, diabetes crisis, all across the state, partly because there are no resources left. So let's not blindly just follow educational institutions with their current DNA. Somebody mentioned the DNA issue. What does education need to deliver? It does not need to deliver only raw labor for the industrial workforce, which is a model that the current system was built on. So I think when we talk about a new civilization, we are talking about institutional revamping. Every single institution has to be studied under a microscope, and fundamental changes, some of which were talked about my brother here, have to be brought in as part of the DNA. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a gentleman there. We are running late anyway,
Yes.
but there is a gentleman who really wants to ask something.
Yes. So earlier, young people have been really asking about money, trying to start new businesses. But I think this is a good opportunity to also think about communities that these businesses are trying to go into and, provide new solutions. So what I'm asking is, in terms of business, what values are you looking into after what you've had as a way to engage those communities? But also I'm thinking about the practical step out of this session in terms of Club of Rome advancing the very same principles that the brother there pushed for, because I think we are looking all over, but communities are doing this work already. These forms of relations between humans and nature already exist. So the work that we're supposed to do shouldn't be so big. So practically, how do you as Club of Rome take up a position to say, we're going to push for communities or new set of values that are going to be advanced, even with those who are trying to come up with new solutions, business opportunities to speak to climate mitigation.
Who wants to react to that?
A couple of hands up. You want to take a few questions?
But, dear co-president, how much time do we have?
I'll give you a few more minutes, but you've got Lena, I think, who wants to respond also with the communities.
Yes, I would like to respond to the education question, to the storytelling question, to the indigenous knowledge question, and to the economic question, because there's a story about Europe that we have not been good at telling, which relates very much to the agricultural societies around the globe, which is how we transformed our agricultural societies into modern societies. And parts of that were all these local communities where a guy with a box went from house to house and collected a little bit of money each month, which became the collective health insurance, and which became the local bank, and which became all these little institutions that grew out of local communities. And part of that was also the folk schools. That's a long Scandinavian story. I'm not going to spare you the details. But that was about educating the young farmhands to go back to their villages in order to build strong local communities and become community organizers. And from those schools and from this tradition grew a lot of strong cooperatives. And one thing that I learned about visiting Niger and Uganda was that there has been a lot of cooperative initiatives in Africa in order to strengthen local economies, but they've all started at the production side, and there's been no local market for it. The cooperatives that work in the UK and in the rest of Europe started at the consumer side, and they created local supermarkets, grocery stores. So there's a lot of experience in Europe dealing with the exact same issues. And my question to you, and that's more to the audience actually, if we told that story, how can we tell it so that it relates to you and doesn't just become another story about a bunch of white people far away? Because I really want to relate to your situation and share our history. So if you would like to discuss that, please come up to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lene. So we are finishing. We're really, yeah, I know. I mean, there are 2 dozens of hands, but we don't have more time. I will just finish by thanking the participants in the panel and all of you for having been participating in this session. I said at the beginning, Club of Rome, Club of Home, Club of Hope. What you said brought me hope. You said, you said many things, but you said, I noted, engage into dialogues with others.
And invest in entrepreneurs, especially the ones in this room.
Okay. No boundaries in Africa.
No boundaries, absolutely no boundaries. They don't exist.
And listen the voices from the periphery. I think these 3 messages are very strong. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please don't leave. Stay up here. Okay, so many of you still had your hands up, and what I'd like to propose is, first of all, this discussion does not end here. This is only the beginning. Many of you have asked, what do we do next? So beyond the immediate what we do next, which is we're going to have a darn good party tonight, there is a long-term, I hope, both short and long-term plan of how we can work together. Under the leadership of myself and Mamphela and our members, we have restructured the Club of Rome to carry within its new home 5 what we call impact hubs. And those impact hubs are exactly what we've discussed today. They are hubs or homes for people to come together, both members of the club, partners, all of you, people who truly believe that they have some of the answers and yet want to continue to work to create and co-create solutions together. in these different areas, the climate emergency or planetary emergency, as we have converged the tipping points between biodiversity and climate into an emergency scenario over the next 10 years, we have a series of actions that we will have to bring forward. And those actions will have to be at the local level, the community level, at the national level, at the regional level, and at the international level. It will have to include a consciousness about the importance of all of our commons, the importance that actually a great deal of those natural boundaries are already deteriorating, that the melting glaciers, that's irreversible. So that is the 10-year plan for some of these impact hubs. But then we have a long-term story. If we're going to act in the next 10 years, we have to build the foundation for real systemic change. Because we talked about financing change, but we also talked about changing finance. We talked about potentially having to bundle indicators over the next 10 years so that GDP growth is no longer the central core of how we measure growth, but brought in alongside the happiness index, the well-being index, different interpretations of what real value is. That is reclaiming economics and reframing economics, both in a 10-year timeline, as well as moving towards the development of what will have to be new civilizations. To do that, we know that we have to do it together. Men, women, Africans, Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans, all of the people, with their own tailor-made solutions, because my solution in Belgium is not yours necessarily, although some of those solutions may be the same, but just need to be scaled differently. We might need macro grids in some areas and micro grids in others. We might need to take up micro projects and microfinancing for some community projects, but have some major shifts done by the IMF, the EIB, the major multilateral development banks. We talked a lot about the bottom up. We talked less about the big changes that will need to be top down. As horrible as that sounds, we have to hold the major institutions, the major governments accountable. Yes, we need to individually help. Yes, we need to act at the community level. But we also need to remember that power is what is destroying this planet. And if we want power to speak to the people, we've got to elect the right politicians, we've got to change the major institutions, and we can't just do it at the local level. This has to be the greatest massive change that humanity has ever seen in order to fend off the existential risk that we have before us. So the Club of Rome, the Club of Home, will come back here in South Africa. That is for sure. Because what we learned today is that we're all on the same journey. And what we learned today is exactly what Mamphela wanted us to learn. When we spoke about this conference, she had so much hope that this would be the first stone in the building block for a new regional hub for the Club of Home in Africa. I think it's clear that the young voices we heard today said that's what we want. It's clear from the Club of Rome members today that that is what we want. And all of those that have been here have shown that that is what we need. So I'd like to end with a few thoughts linked to, and now I can't remember, I think it was our last panel. that spoke about the importance of coming together under a tree. As we came home to Africa, I would like you to take that analogy of a tree. We've now become rerouted. The trunk will be our anchor to hold up the leaves, the diversity, the beauty of the people around us. We are the holders of this new truth. And it is our responsibility, each and individual, but also as a collective whole, to continue to share these stories, to continue to share our knowledge, to continue to share the solutions, and ensure that we enable them to come to fruition. So that when we come home next time, there will be more of us and a real appreciation for this planet that we call home. So now I'd like to close in honor of Mamphela Ramphele, this first summit in Africa. Thank you for allowing us to come home. And now let's go and party.